right, I'm going to start by reading the psalm for today, Psalm 8. I'm reading the version from the Jewish Study Bible, but I'll be completely honest, I've changed some of the language to be gender inclusive, because that's just how I like to read the Bible. So here is Psalm 8 from the Jewish Study Bible. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. Can't you just hear that from what the choir's saying? How majestic is your name throughout the earth. You who have covered the heavens with your splendor. From the mouths of infants and sucklings you have founded strength on account of your foes, to put an end to enemy and avenger. When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place, what are humans that you have been mindful of them? Mortals, that you have taken note of them, that you have made them a little less than divine, and adorned them with glory and majesty. You have made them master over your handiwork, laying the world at their feet, sheep and oxen, all of them, and wild beasts too, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, whatever travels the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. Whenever I hear or read this psalm, I am immediately taken to the first creation story from the first chapter in Genesis. That first creation story in which every day as God creates, God declares it good. Each day is completed with those words, and God saw that it was good. Creating light and darkness, separating the heavens from the earth, separating the sea and the dry land, and creating vegetation, separating day and night, and creating the sun and the moon and the stars, creating the creatures of the sea and the birds of the air, creating all creatures who live on land, creating male and female in the image of God, giving them dominion over God's handiwork. Throughout this first creation story, at every stage of every day, God saw that it was good. This psalm, Psalm 8, speaks to that goodness of God's creation, to the goodness imbued in us as humans. As a psalm of orientation, it doesn't get much more basic than that. God created us a little less than divine, adorned us with glory and majesty, laying at our feet God's creation. I have to be honest, sometimes I wonder if God has more faith in humanity than we have in ourselves. We have in each other. God created us in goodness. And yet there are days where it can be seriously hard to see the goodness around. Sometimes it's hard to see the goodness in ourselves. Sometimes it's much easier to look at each other or to look at ourselves and focus on all the things we don't think are good. Unfortunately, part of this focus on the negative of humanity comes from our own Christian history. When we read the Psalms or Genesis, we read it through our Christian lens. Of course we do. How else are we going to read it? When we read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we read it through a lens of centuries of Christian theology and doctrine, and so we read it differently than those who wrote it. We read it with a different lens than the authors and the original community that it was written for. And while it's difficult or perhaps impossible to let go of that Christian lens, sometimes when we try, it can offer us a new understanding or a new insight into the Hebrew text. What might these words have meant to those first hearing them? But in Christianity, we have the concept of original sin. You've probably heard of it. And whether we accept the concept or have rejected it, the idea remains. It is part of our Christian history. And original sin is actually understood differently depending on which branch of Christianity one follows. It is either a reference to the first sinful act of Adam and Eve when they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a reference to a singular event, the original sin, or it is a reference to a state of being, a sinful state of being as a result of Adam and Eve's first action. The idea that humans are sinful by nature from birth. Original sin. There are other ways, but those are the main two ways of understanding original sin. But original sin is a Christian construction, and it wasn't present in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't present when the Hebrew Bible was written, when it was assembled, when the communities were first hearing these words from the Psalms and from Genesis. Judaism did not and does not believe in the Christian concept of original sin. To be honest, much of Christianity has rejected the concept as well. And this psalm, Psalm 8, is an example of a different train of thought, a different way of understanding human nature and human potential, a different identity in God, one based on original goodness rather than original sin, one based on those words, God saw that it was good. So here again the words from the psalmist, from what was a different perspective, if you can hold that different perspective than how we often hear it. The psalmist said, when I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place, what are humans that you have been mindful of us? Mortals that you have taken note of us, that you have made us just a little less than divine, adorned us with glory and majesty. You have made us master over your handiwork, laying the world at our feet. Sheep and oxen, all of them, the wild beasts too, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, whatever travels the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. God is goodness. And the psalmist praises and offers thanksgiving for creating humans in God's image, for creating humans a little less than divine, for creating humans as good. What might it look like for us as a people of faith to accept and begin in that understanding? To begin with the sense of the goodness of God imbued in us. To begin with the goodness of God imbued in others. To see each other as a little less than divine, adorned with glory and majesty. I'll be honest, when I interact with folks, I don't often think adorned with glory and majesty. Even if I really like you, that's just not the frame. But what if we began to interact with each other as if we were all adorned with glory and majesty? I think there are real consequences to this question. Real consequences to what and how we teach our children about this. Real consequences to how open we are to people unlike or unknown to us. Real consequences to how we understand our own self-worth. You've probably heard by now about the number of teen suicides in the Denver metro area since school started. The response by church leaders and counselors and school officials is often to encourage families to talk to our children, to tell our children that we love them, that we believe in them, that we see the good in them, to remind our children and youth of their own goodness in the midst of the struggle on how to deal with the suicides. This is vitally important in the aftermath of teen suicide, but it is also just as important in the natural and expected moments of teen angst and life lessons by our children, by us. Telling our children they are loved and believed in as a part of their identity. And like I said, it's important not only for our children, but also for ourselves, because our culture has mastered the marketing strategy of convincing us that we are less than, that we aren't okay as we are, that we need to buy some certain product, or if we just go on this particular diet, if we buy these clothes, everything will be okay. We will be better somehow. We are inundated with messages that tell us we aren't worthy of love or happiness or success because of who we are in this moment, but don't worry, there's a product that you can buy that will fix it all. Do you realize how hard it actually was to find an image that was appropriate for the sanctuary? There are a lot of magazine images, but most of which, 99% of which, are half-naked men and women whose bodies have been airbrushed to the point of ridiculousness. It's not even a realistic image. And that's the image put in front of us that we are supposed to aspire to. If only we could be, if only you could have those abs, then you'd be okay. It's a marketing strategy that is brilliant and has worked, but at a cost. And we wonder why mental health and depression and suicide is a growing concern in our community. If the messages we receive on TV and in movies, at stores, in the news, and even from faith leaders is that something is inherently wrong with us, then that message will take hold and become a part of our identity, whether we realize it or not. And yet, the scriptures tell us something different entirely. The scriptures, from Genesis to Psalms to the Gospels, speak of humanity as a reflection of God. Speak of a human identity that is grounded in goodness and has potential for even more goodness. We hear this message in the teachings of Jesus as well. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, Jesus said, "Trust me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on account of the works themselves." And then he says, "I assure you that whoever believes in me will do the works that I do. They will do even greater works than these." Jesus is telling us that we are capable. We are capable of immense goodness. We are capable of following his way and spreading the love of God, neighbor, and self as he did, and even more. We are capable, if only we claim that identity as a child of God, as a follower of Jesus. God saw that it was good. This doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. It doesn't mean we don't need to ask for and to offer forgiveness. It doesn't mean there isn't work that we can constantly do. It doesn't mean that there aren't times we act in ways that separate us from God, and then we have to work to return to God. It means we are capable of immense goodness even in those moments. And not only are we, but so are those we interact with. So are those around our globe. It means we begin with that belief. We begin with goodness because that's where God began. How might we change the conversation if we listened to the words of the psalmist and accepted this original goodness within? Not only within us, but within each other. What might the conversations look like? Not only as individuals, but as a community. What would it look like for St. Luke's community to claim the identity of created in the image of God, of goodness within us as individuals and as a collective? How might the conversations change? Over the last 9 months, there's been a growing tension in our country and in our communities. Conversations are difficult, especially conversations about anything that might seem controversial or political or divisive. And let's be honest, at this point, almost anything can be divisive. How many times have you had family gatherings and you go into it with a list of what you're not going to talk about? And the list is growing. Things can be divisive whether we mean them to be or not. Where do you have those real conversations? For some, there's a growing desire to create a space for these conversations here at St. Luke's. Conversations that stir emotional responses, conversations that can put us on edge, conversations that will have a variety of sides. Conversations about racism and immigration, equality, politics in the church, and this is where I have to be honest, I actually love the conversations about politics in the church. I think they can be fun, but I realize I'm a unique minister in that. But it's also conversations about mental health and missions and outreach, conversations about who we are. One of the tangible outcomes of this kind of growing desire was the creation of the new Faith and Justice team, who are attempting to create that space for open conversations about racism and privilege and immigration. And I'll be honest, that creation of this committee and this space has created tension in and of itself. Enough tension that we debated today whether or not to show the ministry moment at the beginning of service. For some, the phrase white privilege is synonymous to being called a racist. For others, the phrase negates their own personal and family struggles throughout their life. The word privilege is a hard word, and it makes the conversations difficult because we end up talking about different realities while using the same word. Have you ever tried to have that conversation where you use the same language but you have very different meanings? And you just miss each other. But to talk about privilege is not to call someone racist or to place judgment or to negate the reality of their lives, but it often takes a deeper conversation to understand that, to get at what we want to get at. And this is true of all sorts of conversations about all sorts of things. That it takes a deeper conversation. It takes a belief in each other, an awareness of our emotional responses, an openness to ask the why questions without judgment on ourselves or each other. And we actually have an example of how to do this in Jesus himself, who engaged the hard questions throughout his entire ministry. But there is tension, and it can be a hard place to be. And part of why there's tension here is because St. Luke's is a diverse community. When I started a little over a year ago, I was told one of the strengths of this community is that we run the spectrum. Political, religious, social, we run the spectrum. We have folks on the far right and the far left and everywhere in between on every issue you could have, and that's true. It is a strength of this community. And I've known churches whose membership runs the spectrum. And so in order to keep the peace, the church avoids any conversation. The church avoids bringing up anything that might create pushback or that might make it difficult. And so very little conversations happen. But we've chosen a different path. We've chosen not to avoid. We've chosen to believe in the goodness of this congregation. We've chosen to believe that even though we're not all going to agree, nor do we think we all need to agree on any one issue, we can still respect each other. We can still be in relationship, in community. We can still be in conversation. We can learn from each other's personal experiences. We've chosen to believe in the people of St. Luke's and our ability to hold this tension and live in it together. And then together to spread Jesus' message of love. And it's not the easy path. We're not pretending it is. It's not the easy path, but I believe it is the faithful path. The path to abundant life. The path that reveals God's presence with us. I believe it is the path we take when we've claimed an identity based on God's love and Christ's message. And we are given this opportunity to claim our identity not simply once, but over and over every day as we decide who we're going to be. Are we children of God, every one of us? I go back to the psalmist. When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, what are humans that you have been mindful of us? Mortals that you've taken note of us. That you've made us a little less than divine and adorned us with glory and majesty. You've made us master over your handiwork, laying the world at our feet, sheep and oxen, all of them, and wild beasts too, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever travels the path of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. Can we claim an identity that the psalmist offers us? As we move through this sermon series of the Psalms, we're invited to respond on the whiteboards throughout the sanctuary. This week we're in the blue marker again because we're still in orientation, and I've been asked to remind you to write small because we have 4 more weeks on these whiteboards. The worship band will begin their song, and as they sing, you're invited to respond to the question, where do you see goodness in your world? Where do you see goodness in your world?